Hello, everybody. Welcome to Concept 2.5, the costs of inflation, is what we're getting into right now. We're also going to do 2.6 in the same video. So let's get to it. Here we go. So 2.5, the cost of inflation. So different people are affected differently by inflation. So for the sake of this, we're considering all of these to be those that are hurt by inflation going up. So inflation rising. If I was talking about inflation going down, I would call it disinflation. So there are some that are helped by it and there are some that are hurt by it. Let's start with those that are hurt by inflation. Just think of those whose wages or whose lifestyle is going to be negatively impacted when prices rise. So the losers or those that are hurt are anybody that's on a fixed income. So people who are pensioners, right? This is a picture of senior citizens. Look how happy they are in their retirement. They are actually hurt by inflation because they get a pension, right? Well, that's the assumption here. A pension is just an annual salary. You get the same amount until for the rest of your life, right? As a retiree. Well, when inflation goes up, that same amount of money you get every single year, that is diminished, right? The buying power of it is diminished, and you actually get poorer and poorer every single year. People have fixed step incomes, which is most teachers actually have a fixed step income. So each year you get an additional step, a raise, right? Those raises are actually negatively impacted by inflation. So when I get a raise next year because I'm in my 15th year of teaching or 16th year of teaching, when I get that raise, well, a part of that raise is going to be diminished by the inflation, right? Because it's not going to have as much of an impact on my wealth as if I hadn't had inflation, right? Next is minimum wage. If you make minimum wage, and this is a big debate right now, right? If you make minimum wage, that wage is an anchor, right? It pulls wages of all unskilled labor down, like you're at the bottom here. And so those people make that same wage no matter what. Well, as prices continue to rise, your quality of life continues to fall. Your real income, to borrow a term from before, falls. So you are definitely hurt if you are fixed income. Think of it as pensioners, fixed step, minimum wage people whose wages don't really depend or adjust with prices. Okay. Also hurt are people that put their money in the bank. If you save your money, then your buying power of those savings is actually diminished, right? So generally, you have an interest rate you get for saving money. So, for example, right now, the interest rate, let's say, is 1% for putting money in the bank. So you're putting it in the bank, you're not going to touch it. The bank pays you 1% because they're going to take your money and re-lend it out or something like that. So you get paid 1% for keeping your money in there. Well, that money, as inflation rises, it erodes the value of that money. So if inflation rates are like 5%, then every year you are 4% poorer than you were before, right? Your savings are diminished. The buying power is diminished by 4%, right? So when inflation rate is bigger or greater than the interest rate, savers have no incentive to save. In fact, you'll see people take their money out of the bank and start spending it more frequently, which can cause hyperinflation. So savers are hurt. So far, fixed income, the savers are hurt. This fixed some income, savers, and then lenders, thistle. The lenders are hurt as well. When they lend you money, that money has its maximum buying power. They get paid that money back in the future, but the money they get paid back with, if inflation is happening, the money they get paid back with is actually diminished in value. Inflation erodes the buying power of that money. So I give you $1,000 today. A year from now, you give me $1,000 back. Well, inflation means that $1,000 I get in the future is worth less than the $1,000 I lent you before. So lenders are hurt as well, right? When they lend money, it erodes the value of that money, so they get paid back in the future, and time is not pretty for them. Now, of course, banks try to offset this. How do I offset it? I offset it by raising interest rates. I say, hey, you're going to pay me back. Not only are you going to pay me back the real interest rate, my profits, but you're also going to pay me back inflation. And that gives us something called nominal interest rates, which we'll talk about here in a second. Lenders are hurt, but they try to mitigate those consequences. So those that are hurt by inflation, thistle. Fixed income, savers, lenders. Thistle. It's ridiculous, but it'll help you remember it. Fixed income, savers, lenders. Who benefits? Well, there are two benefactors, beneficiaries. been a something. First are businesses, right? Businesses actually love inflation because when inflation goes up, they raise their prices immediately, but they don't have to change their wages, all right, how much they pay their workers. If you think about it, when I hire somebody, normally I hire them on a contract. So I might hire them at the same salary for the next 3 years. Well, it's not until those 3 years are up that we renegotiate those wages. So that means when prices rise, prices are going up. Wages are here, prices rise. The difference between what I can sell products for and the cost of making it is my profit. So inflation actually creates temporary profits, which are really, really good for businesses. Businesses love it. Prices go up, wages stay the same, they produce more, they make more profit. Businesses benefit from inflation in the short run. Also, we have borrowers. Remember, lenders are hurt by this, which means that borrowers are helped. I borrow money at the front end that has maximum buying power. At the end of this loan, I pay it back, but the money I pay back is actually worth less than the money I borrowed earlier. So I got more buying power of the money on the front end than they will have in the buying power I give back to them. But of course, that is mitigated through raising interest rates to something we call nominal interest rate. So who benefits? BBB. Benefit is borrowers and businesses. BBB, right? Benefit borrower businesses. Who is helped? Thistle. I'm sorry, hurt. Thistle. Thistle are hurt, right? Fixed income savers, lenders are hurt. Benefits are BBB, borrowers and businesses. Okay, let's keep going. So when this happens, inflation actually redistributes income. It redistributes it from those that are hurt to those that are helped. So inflation actually takes money away from fixed income earners, savers, and our lenders. It takes money away from them and it gives it to our businesses and our borrowers. So it redistributes income, which is actually not ideal, right? We don't want that redistribution because it's really arbitrary. It's being redistributed for no reason. There's no merit to it. It's just because prices are going up. So this actually has negative consequences on our economy as a whole. However, if you can anticipate inflation, then we assume that you will take whatever steps necessary to mitigate the negative outcomes, right? So if households know that interest rates are going up in the future, what will we do? We'll demand higher wages. When we go to get higher, we say, hey, I anticipate interest rates are going to be higher, or not, sorry, not interest rates. I anticipate that inflation rates are going to be higher in the future. If inflation is going to be higher in the future, then I want a higher wage now to offset those increase in prices, right? We also request things called COLAs built into our contracts. COLAs are cost of living adjustments, COLA, which says, hey, I want to maintain this certain quality of life that I'm coming in at. So you need to adjust my wages. This isn't a raise, just automatically adjust my wages based on what the inflation rate is at the time. So if inflation rate's going up 10%, then my wages should go up 10% plus my raise in order to offset those changing prices. Okay, so if I anticipate it, I'm going to mitigate that. Banks do the same thing. I was promising that I'd talk about this. Banks anticipate inflation as well. If I anticipate inflation, I'm going to do whatever it takes to mitigate the negative effects, to get rid of them, right? So banks just charge a premium. The real interest rate is the profit that banks make from lending you money, right? They charge you an interest rate, but they don't want to sit there holding the bag for inflation. They don't want to pay that. They don't want it to chunk into their profits. So they add inflation rate to it. So if the real interest rate is 5%, the inflation rate is 7%, then you're going to pay 12% in interest, right? In fact, consumers always, always, always pay the nominal interest rate. Right now, the real interest rates are at about zero to 1%. And the Federal Reserve's involved to give banks profits and all that stuff. But interest rates are super low. Inflation rate is pretty low too, at like 2.5, 3%. So the nominal interest rates that borrowers are paying is actually around 2.5 to 3.5%. That's real interest rate plus inflation rate. That's what we actually pay. Now, of course, banks can get it wrong. If banks bet that the inflation rate is going to be 5%, but the inflation rate is actually 12%, well, they didn't really protect themselves, and them, as the lenders, the L of FISL, are actually going to be hurt by that more. Okay? Let's keep going. Concept 2.6, real versus nominal GDP. So we've talked about real and nominal wages a little bit, right? We said, hey, nominal wages is what you actually get paid. Real is adjusted for inflation. We're going to apply that same principle to GDP. So nominal GDP measures output and prices all together. That says output and prices, right? They're all combined. So in year one, let's say this nation produces only forks and spoons. In year one, they sell 100 forks for $1 and 200 spoons for $2. So my total GDP there, if that's all that I produce, is going to be $100 in forks, $400 in spoons. So I'm going to have $500 in GDP there. So this is going to be 500 bucks, just the value of what I produce. In year two, if the nation produces 200 forks for $3 and sells them for $3 and 100 spoons for $4, well, that gives me a different number. So now it's 200 times 3, that's 600, and 100 times 4, that's 400, that's $1,000. It looks like my GDP has risen significantly. And in fact, my nominal GDP has. The actual value, the price times quantity, which is what nominal GDP is, the price of my goods times the amount of goods I produce, that has gone up significantly. But if I look closer, notice that what I produced didn't go up very much at all. It changed, but it didn't go up. I had 100 forks and 200 spoons, so I produced 300. In year two, I had 200 forks and 100 spoons, so I produced 300. So we have to adjust this. That's not actually an accurate picture. Remember, GDP is gross domestic product, not gross domestic prices. So how do I adjust for that? I use my equations for real GDP. So let me get rid of those. Moving on. So, question, which of these is a more accurate measure, right? Nominal GDP says I sold 100 cars at $1,000 a piece. So it's just price times quantity. So it's $100,000. In year two, I sold 100 cars for $2,000 each. That's $200,000. Did my GDP actually go up by $100,000 worth? Are people actually living $100,000 worth of an increased quality of life? The answer is probably not, right? I produced 100 cars in both years. So real GDP takes that and looks at it in real terms, right? It says, hey, I sold 100 cars for $1,000. In year two, I sold those same 100 cars. I'm not going to multiply it by my current year. I'm going to look at my base year. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that 100 cars. I'm going to multiply it by the original $1,000 to see what happened to my real GDP. So I'm taking out the impact of inflation, the increase in prices of 1,000 to 2,000. I take that out of the equation. I'm just looking at cars times my base year price. And so that gives me 100,000. So the reality is my economy didn't change at all from year one to year two. GDP grew by 0%. Real GDP is a much more accurate measure of what's going on in my economy. It is the winner, right? So we will always, when we have nominal GDP, we will always take the impact of inflation out of it so that we can better identify what's going on with the production in our economy rather than just what's going on with prices. So converting something from real to nominal GDP is really about just taking inflation out of the equation. So we adjust for inflation is what we call it. Nominal, price times quantity. Real, adjusted for inflation. For example, if in year one I sold $500 of GDP, which is 100 tacos at $5, and in year two I have $1,000 of GDP, which is 100 tacos at $10. Is that what actually happened in year two? Or could it be $1,000 of nominal GDP is 200 tacos at $5? Or $1,000 of nominal GDP is 1,000 tacos at $1? We don't really know what's going on with our production when we look at nominal GDP. When I adjust for inflation, I can actually compare year to year because the changes are production. They're not either production or prices. They are production because I adjust for inflation. So we will always, always, always adjust for inflation, take it from nominal to real, because real is always better. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, if nominal GDP is rising, if prices are going up, then I'm going to have to deflate to get real GDP. And if prices are going down, we have disinflation, then I'm going to inflate to get real GDP. So unadjusted for inflation is nominal, adjusted is real. That's why we call it real, because we can actually use it. It's tangible and it doesn't confuse quantity with price like nominal GDP does. Okay? So, how do we do it? Let's get into that finally. We use something called the GDP deflator. The GDP deflator is simply nominal GDP divided by real GDP times 100. It's going to kick out something that we called previously CPI. This is CPI. You just use CPI to figure out or convert nominal to real. Now, it is very rare that you're asked to calculate the deflator. Instead, you are asked to calculate real GDP from nominal. So the better equation is this. Real GDP is nominal GDP divided by the deflator, or CPI, same thing, in hundreds. Let's try this out. If my nominal GDP is, that's my eraser, sorry, no, go back. Here we go. If my nominal GDP is $100, 100, and my CPI is 120, meaning since the base year, my prices have risen by 20%. What's going to happen? Well, I'm going to have to deflate this number to get real GDP. So I just plug this in. My nominal GDP, 100, divided by my deflator in the hundreds, which is 1.2. So it's going to be 100 divided by 1.2, and that will kick out my real GDP. So you just find your CPI, divide by it in hundreds. So you move that decimal over 2. Let's see what we got here. Calculator. 100 divided by 1.2 gives me 83.3. So my real GDP is going to be 83.3. Notice, it's less than my nominal GDP. Prices were rising. I have to adjust for that. I have to adjust it down. I have to deflate it. That's why we call it the deflator. So I take the inflation out, I deflate it, and my real GDP is $83.33. Okay, that's nominal versus real. Key takeaways here. Make sure you know that nominal GDP is not adjusted for inflation. Real is adjusted for inflation. Know that real GDP is a better measure because I can actually determine if it's quantity or price, right? Because I take the price metric out. So any changes have to be changes in my production, not changes in prices, which just colludes things and makes it difficult to figure out. So we adjust for real GDP, and then from this point forward, all of our GDP numbers, unless they tell you to convert it, all of our GDP numbers are in real terms. We always adjust for inflation every single time. Okay? Now, it is possible that you're given a percent change in nominal GDP and the inflation rate. You just plug it into the same thing as our real. So if my nominal GDP changed, nominal GDP increased by 4%, and inflation increased by 2%, then my change in real GDP is just going to be 4 minus 2, because I'm giving those percent changes, 4 minus 2. My real GDP changed by plus 2%. Okay, so whenever you're given percent changes, it's pretty easy to adjust those. Just percent change in nominal minus inflation equals percent change in real. And we showed that same thing when we were looking at nominal interest rates. Percent change in or percentage of real interest rates plus inflation equals nominal interest rates. And it'd be just as accurate to say nominal interest rates minus inflation equals real. Real is adjusted for inflation. It's taken away. Nominal is not adjusted for inflation, so it colludes the two. Okay, hopefully that was helpful to you. We'll do some more practice with this in class. Until then, I should mention, it is possible to measure this without nominal GDP. So you can simply take current nominal production or quantity times base year prices. That's a complex way to do it, but it is possible. If I'm given base year prices for my goods and I have current quantities, I just take those current quantities and multiply them by base year prices. We'll give you some examples of that in class as well. That's it for now. You will have some time to do your Khan Academy. There are 2 of them, 2.5, 2.6, cost of inflation, and real versus nominal GDP. Give it a shot. Remember, they're intentionally difficult, so don't fret if it's difficult to do. Peace.